We've decided to separate our video on U.S. Grant Cottage 2022 Gala into 3 segments. That's because there were 3 notable speakers with important things to say about the General during our special fundraiser at the Gideon Putnam Hotel in Saratoga Springs. One of the headliners at the event was Treat Williams, who is developing a play about Grant from his best-selling memoirs. Treat is an honorary board member of Grant Cottage and did not charge for his appearance. Following dinner at the gala, I introduced our master of ceremonies of the event, the General's great-great-grandson, Ulysses Grant Dietz, who then introduced the star of the recent Hallmark Channel series, Chesapeake Shores.
You know, I have some bad news. We had promised you that the great-great-grandson of Ulysses S. Grant would be here in person. However, there's something called COVID-19 going around, or maybe it's COVID-22. In any case, he's feeling pretty well, but in the interest of not wanting to infect anyone, Ulysses Grant Dietz, who grew up in Syracuse, New York, is going to be here virtually to conduct our evening's events. I want to introduce him to you now. He studied French at Yale. Oh, before I give you his bio, 10 years ago, we had an event at the Canfield Casino. He hosted it. Well, I hosted it and I introduced him. And he was the best speaker that you ever could imagine. Now, he was a curator at the Newark Museum for 37 years before he retired. He is the great-great-grandson of Ulysses S. Grant. His mother, Julia, was the president's last living great-grandchild. Ladies and gentlemen, Ulysses Grant Dietz.
There I am. Now, yes, I'm unmuted, and I'm coming to you from my office, virtually by the miracle of technology, my office, which is also my dining room. And I have no way of knowing if you can actually hear me, but I appreciated everything that President Welch has said. I love the introduction, and I'm feeling pretty good. And the fact that I'm still testing positive for COVID is the reason I'm still in New Jersey and not with you in Saratoga Springs. And I'm very sorry to be missing, especially the dessert tonight, because it looked really good. But I made myself a drink and got dressed. I'm completely dressed. And I'm happy to be with you. Now, my first task is to talk to you a minute. And my second task is then to introduce Treat Williams, who, as you are, I'm hugely looking forward to hearing. I have not seen this performance or heard him speak on one of his favorite topics. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit, picking up on what President Welch said, is that, one, why am I here and why does this matter? I think everything that President Welch said about the education pavilion and taking over the ball field and removing the razor wire fence, when we brought our children up to visit the cottage, they weren't as enthusiastic at the ages of 8 and 9 as we were, but I have a great picture of them clutching them on the porch of the Grant Cottage as, in my memory, prisoners playing softball were lined up at the fence watching us. So it's a very vivid memory, and the idea of having access to that space and making use out of this extraordinary setting where Grant Cottage is something that I think would be hugely important. And of course, as a curator who worked my whole career in a museum, and where I was all about education for adults and for children, needless to say, this is something that matters a lot to me. But really what I wanted to get down to was the personal side of it is why was I supposed to be significant being there in person, and why I hope I can still get some message across to you virtually this way. It's because I was told that on each of your tables is a photograph that is iconic related to the cottage, which is that sort of family portrait of the poor, dying Ulysses S. Grant, surrounded by his 4 children, his two of his daughters-in-law and 3 of his grandchildren, and his wife, all of them seated in this kind of, to me, hugely powerful symbol of a family gathered to await the inevitable end, even as U.S. Grant himself, suffering mightily from throat cancer, was racing to finish what would become the best-selling memoir in the history of the United States, and certainly the greatest military memoir ever written in this country, even to today, although maybe I'm biased. And the reason it matters to me, the reason I'm here, the reason I wanted to be with you in person tonight was because of that picture. Because if you look at that picture, you've got U.S. Grant in his top hat, looking exhausted but determined. And next to him, standing next to him, is his oldest son, Fred, who was also an Army officer. His dutiful son, the one who was with him the most during his last month at Mount McGregor. And Fred is my great-grandfather, my mother's grandfather. And right below Fred is seated his beautiful wife, Ida, who was a Chicago girl, who he met and fell in love with and married and lived with until the end of his life. And right below them, right sort of nestled up next to Ida, I don't have the picture in front of me and I'm trying to remember it, but I know pretty well, is a little boy looking a little sullen, as little boys will, with a straw hat and long ringlets. And that's my grandfather. That's Ulysses S. Grant III, who would also follow his father and his grandfather to West Point and graduate in 1903, number 6 in his class, doing way better than his father did and rather better than his grandfather did. And just to the other side of little Ulysses is his big sister, Julia, after whom my mother was named, who lived until she was 99 years old and who I got to meet once at my grandfather's funeral. So in that picture, in the Grant Cottage, there is an enormous amount of family continuity, enormous amount of family history. And so if Grant Cottage is famous because it's where Grant finished his memoirs and died, and the moment when my great-grandfather Fred stopped the clock in the parlor, and all of those flower memorials came flooding in as the national mourning for the death of U.S. Grant began, I can't think of anything better than that to explain the reason why that memorial, just like Grant's tomb in New York City, which is his ultimate resting place, but let's say the beginning of his final resting place is Grant Cottage, if the tomb is the finale of that. And I got involved with my name and my heritage, and Frank Scatoro, who's in the audience tonight, because of Grant's tomb back in 1987, when I still didn't really know what I was talking about and didn't quite understand why my name made a difference in the world. So before I turn to Treat Williams, I just wanted to bring that forward, is that Grant Cottage is a small place, but it's a mighty place. And everybody who visits there, who I've ever talked to, who has been there, is kind of blown away by the emotional power of that historical setting. And in this day and age, when it's a very good time to be descended from Ulysses S. Grant, which it wasn't so much in the 1950s when I was born and named after that little boy in the straw hat on the front steps of the cottage, who was appalled, and which is why I was called Grant growing up, not Ulysses. But it's a great time in the world to be descended from U.S. Grant. And I wish I could be with you tonight, but I will certainly look forward to what I'm going to be witnessing for the rest of the evening. And I will be back. We will talk more. But right now, I want to introduce Treat Williams, who will be more entertaining than I, and will... Oh, people can hear me. That's good. I'm staring at 2 images of myself on my computer screen, so that's a little crazy. But so Treat Williams is somebody I've known about for a long, long time, and I was really looking forward to meeting him in person tonight, but he's a 4-time Golden Globe nominee and an Emmy nominee. And Treat Williams has acted in over 100 feature films and movies for television. He began his career as Danny Zuko in Grease on Broadway. He came to prominence in the films Hair, which I have seen, and Prince of the City. He was twice nominated for the Screen Actors Guild for the role of Andy Brown in Everwood. Williams currently stars as Mick O'Brien in Chesapeake Shore on the Hallmark Channel, and has recently been seen in Blue Bloods and We Own the City for HBO. He's currently working on a one-man show about Ulysses S. Grant, and he comes to Saratoga all the way from Manchester, Vermont. And without any further shenanigans, let's bring Treat Williams out. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give you just a little bit of a background. I wanted to write something about Grant and do something because I played Hal Holbrook's son in a TV movie about 20 years ago. And when I was about 15 years old, he came to the Kent School in Connecticut and did Mark Twain Tonight. And I think it was one of the things that made me decide that I wanted to be an actor. It was an extraordinary evening. I don't know if you ever get a chance to see it, but it was quite astounding. And it was, again, a one-man show. And so I began this idea of possibly doing one about Ulysses Grant, who I always thought got short-shrifted as the guy with the beard in the background who drank too much, which is not who he is at all. And as I began to work on it over the past 5 or 6 years, interestingly, I realized I was working on a play about a man who had a great deal of saving a country that was at odds with itself from falling apart. And I think that speaks to where we are now. He died at the cottage, and I thought, why not have Grant at the cottage at the end of his life, writing his memoirs. And he was told by his editor, Mark Twain, who took over, and told him that, you know, it's really good, but you're not putting any of yourself into it. So the conceit of the play, and I haven't finished it yet, but the conceit is that Grant is at the cottage and he has invited good friends to try out more of being more personal in his memoirs than he was, which were very dry and quite just facts. And I think he did very well with the advice he got from Twain. So this is basically the end of the play, and the reason I chose this passage, it's mostly Grant, it's not me, it's his words, but it speaks to the great empathy he had for his enemy, and in Lee's surrender and how he handled himself. So I'd just like to read that passage to you. I would like to share with you an event which affected me deeply and has stayed with me always in great clarity. I want to tell you about one man for whom I have great respect. General Robert E. Lee was as great a man and general as I have ever known. After the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, General Lee realized he was cut off from his remaining forces. Although I knew that the surrender of Lee's army was inevitable, I did not know when or how much fighting would be necessary for the event to take place. On the 8th of April, 1864, I began a correspondence with him regarding that possibility. The next day, I was suffering very severely with a sick headache and stopped at a farmhouse on a road some distance from the rear of the army. I spent the night bathing my feet in hot water and mustard, and putting mustard on my wrists and the back of my neck, hoping to be cured by the morning. During the night, I received Lee's answer to the letter of the 8th, inviting an interview between the lines on the following morning. But it was for a different purpose from that of surrendering his army, and so I answered him with this. Your note of yesterday is received. As I have no authority to treat on the subject of peace, the meeting proposed for 10 a.m. today could lead to no good. I will state, however, General, that I am equally anxious for peace with yourself, and the whole North entertains that feeling. The terms upon which peace can be had are well understood. By the South laying down their arms, they will hasten that most desirable event, save thousands of human lives and hundreds of millions of property not yet destroyed, sincerely hoping that all our difficulties may be settled without the loss of another life. I subscribe myself, U.S. Grant. Lee sent an officer bearing this message to me. General, I received your note this morning on the picket line whither I had come to meet you and ascertain definitely what terms were embraced in your proposal of yesterday with reference to the surrender of this army. I now request an interview in accordance with the offer contained in your letter of yesterday for that purpose. When the officer reached me, I was still suffering with the sick headache, but the instant I saw the contents of the note, I was cured. I replied to him that I would meet him at the place of his choosing. General Sheridan was located with his troops drawn up in a line of battle facing the Confederate Army nearby. They were very much excited and expressed their view that this was all a ruse employed to enable the Confederates to get away. But I had no doubt about the good faith of Lee, and pretty soon was conducted to where he was. I found him at the house of a Mr. McLean. When I left camp that morning, I had not expected so soon the result that was then taking place, and consequently, I was in rough garb. I was without a sword, as usually was on horseback in the field, and wore a soldier's blouse for a coat, with the shoulder straps of my rank to indicate to the army who I was. When I went into the house, I found General Lee. We greeted each other, and after shaking hands, we took our seats. What General Lee's feelings were, I do not know. As he was a man of much dignity with an impassible face, it was impossible to say whether he felt inwardly glad that the end had finally come, or felt sad over the result and was too manly to show it. Whatever his feelings, they were entirely concealed from my observation. But my own feelings, which had been quite jubilant on receipt of his letter, were sad and depressed. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and so valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause which a people ever fought, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. I do not question, however, the sincerity of the great mass of those who were opposed to us. General Lee was dressed in full uniform, which was entirely new. In my rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private with straps of a lieutenant general, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high and faultless of form. But this was not a matter that I thought of till afterwards. We soon fell into conversation about old times. Our conversation grew so pleasant that I almost forgot the object of our meeting. General Lee called my attention to it and said that he had asked me for this interview for the purpose of getting from me the terms I proposed to give to his army. I told him that the terms were the officers and men were never again to take arms up against the United States, and that their arms, artillery, and public property be turned over to my officers. Their officers could keep their sidearms, horses, and baggage. They could then return to their homes. Upon hearing they could keep their sidearms and horses, he remarked with some feeling that this would have a happy effect upon his army. I then said to him that I thought this would be the last battle of the war. I sincerely hoped so. And I said further, I took that most of the men in the ranks were small farmers. The whole country had been so raided by the two armies that it was doubtful whether they would be able to put in a crop to carry themselves and their families through the next winter without the aid of horses that they were riding. The United States did not want them, and I would therefore let every man of the Confederate Army who claimed to own a horse or a mule to take that animal to his home. Lee remarked again that this would have a happy effect. General Lee, after all was completed, and before taking his leave, remarked that his army was in a very bad condition for want of food, and that his men had been living for some days on parched corn exclusively, and that he would have to ask me for rations and forage. I told him certainly and asked for how many men he wanted rations for. His answer was about 25,000. I answered and authorized him to have all the provisions that he wanted. When the news of the surrender first reached our lines, our men commenced firing a salute of 100 guns in honor of the victory. I at once said word, however, to have it stopped. The Confederates were now our prisoners, and we did not want to exult in their downfall. Before leaving, I thought I would like to see General Lee again, so next morning I rode out beyond our lines towards his headquarters, preceded by a bugler and a staff officer carrying a white flag. Lee soon mounted his horse, seeing who it was, and met with me. I was accompanied by my staff and other officers, some of whom seemed to have a great desire to go inside of the Confederate lines. They finally asked permission of Lee to do so, and the permission was granted. They went over and had a very pleasant time with their old friends and brought some of them back when they returned. When Lee and I separated, he went back to his lines, and I returned to the house of Mr. McLean. Here, the officers of both armors came in great numbers and seemed to enjoy the meeting, as though they were friends separated for a long time while fighting battles under the same flag. For the time being, it looked very much as if all thoughts of war had escaped their minds. The lights fade on Grant as he considers this peaceful, hopeful moment in American history. As they fade, he lights a match, brings a cigar to his mouth. We are left with the glow of the cigar in the darkness, and then blackout.
Ulysses Dietz appeared via Zoom at our event because he had tested positive for COVID-19 and wanted to honor his commitments without spreading the virus. More than 325 guests paid $125 each to listen to Dietz, as well as General David Patraeus, a 4-star former head of the CIA, and Grant biographer Ron Chernow. Stay tuned for those video clips from the U.S. Grant Cottage Gala in October of 2022, which was a commemoration of the General's 200th birthday and a fundraiser for U.S. Grant Cottage.